Hello and welcome to the DMPL Podcast. I'm Aaron Gernes, your host, and I'm moving my camera around here already because the sun is coming right in perfectly. But it's going to be hopefully a sunny day next Thursday, December 12th, when Don Tate, our guest today, joins us at the Forest Avenue Library. Don, how are you doing today?
I am doing so well, and yeah, fingers crossed that the weather is nice. I'm not a cold weather person. I'm fully acclimated to my home in Texas, so
Well, Don Tate is a children's author and illustrator. As you can see, he has some of his books behind him if you're watching on YouTube. And yeah, he grew up here in Des Moines and he lives in Texas now. So, Don, tell us a little bit about growing up in Des Moines, kind of the area you were in and like what growing up in Des Moines did for you as you became a writer and illustrator.
yeah. So I grew up not very far from the Forest Avenue Library. I grew up in the Chautauqua Park neighborhood,
Yeah.
just maybe I don't know 3 minutes away from the Forest Avenue Library. My childhood library when I was very young was the old Dowling High School location.
Nice.
So I would um, I would go down the gully, cross the water in the gully, come up the hill, and go to the library where I would spend time with the librarians who knew that I was not a reader, but would have makerspace activities set up for artists like me. So I would go to the library and I would make crafts.
That's awesome. Where was the old Dowling High School location? I guess honestly I've been in Des Moines for 18 years now, but I don't know offhand. I'm sure other people are like rolling their eyes as me as I say this, but I don't know offhand where that actually was.
You know, it's funny because when you grow up in a place, it things are just where they are. So
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I could not tell you the exact address, but if you're familiar with the Grub
Yeah.
YMCA, it's
Yes.
that's the location today.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. I know exactly where that is, and that helps me out a lot, and maybe it helps other people out too. Maybe, like I said, other people are just kind of rolling their eyes at me right now, but that's okay. Um,
Actually, the Forest Avenue Library is where I had one of my very first author events when I got published.
yeah.
That was with Eleanor E. Tate. This was a book that we collaborated on, Retold African Myths,
Oh, that's
and
awesome.
had a library signing right there at Forest Avenue Library many years ago.
Yeah, I was gonna say Forest has been around. I want to say at that location for about 30 years now. I want to say. I know they celebrated their 25th anniversary, but I sometime while I've been working here. But but yeah, it's great to see. Like you said, you were doing a lot of crafts and maker spaces stuff at the library even back then. So the library was always a welcoming place for you. It sounds like.
The library was always a welcoming place for me. I remember one year I went to the library and we made Halloween costumes. We would make crafts at Christmas time, Christmas ornaments, for the trees. And that is the thing that drew me to the library. So the library is always, and I never felt pressured I wasn't a reader,
Hmm.
but I never felt pressured that you've got to come here and you've got to read books. I went to the library and they were open to welcoming me for the non-reader kid that I was. Just having the crafts there is what drew me. So
Did you have like memories of the youth librarian or some of the staff that was there at the time that kind of like would made it welcoming to you like this?
I wish that I did. I don't remember names. I remember when I got older, the library had moved, and this is after I got into publishing.
Hmm.
Some of my early projects, the library had moved to, I believe it was like 13th and University.
Yes, that. Oh, I can't remember what that location was called, but I know exactly what you're talking about
Yeah,
because
and
we
I would
talked
go
about
there
it a
and I
few
would
times.
research. I
Yeah.
would go there for research for some of my early books.
Wow, that's cool. So uh, let's talk about that path. You said you're not a reader, or you weren't a reader as a child, I should say. You're a creative kid, a drawer. You like doing crafts. How does obviously that kind of leads to the illustration path, but how do you become a writer over the course of your career as well? Because you've written a lot of books.
So I grew up, I was an artist, like to keep my hands busy. I went to college in Ankeny, Des Moines area community college at the Ankeny campus in the commercial art program. And then in the late 80s, is when I entered the publishing industry. I started working for the Perfection Learning Corporation in West Des Moines as a book designer. I didn't like designing books. what I liked doing was illustrating books.
What does a
So I
book designer do?
So a book designer works with the writers and the illustrators to determine what the book's going to look like. What is the shape of the book going to be? Is it going to be a horizontally shaped book? Is it going to be tall? They pick the fonts.
Hmm.
Um, they work with the colors to be sure that the colors in the illustrations complement the colors that are used in the design. So the book designers basically decide how many pages a book will be.
It's
So a
kind of
book
like a producer almost.
kind of like excuse me, losing my voice here.
Yeah,
Kind of like a producer, yes.
interesting.
But I didn't want to design books. I wanted to illustrate books. So I was able to convince them to let me be the in-house illustrator.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I fell in love with my job after that.
That's very cool. So yeah, you kind of, it sounds like the book designer is almost more kind of set up by with constraints, if that makes sense. You're working within some guidelines, and you really wanted to find a way to express yourself and through your art, and went down that route instead. What were some of the first projects you worked on when you started illustrating?
So one of the very first opportunities was
Yeah.
retold African myths. I was working at the Perfection Learning Corporation, and I kept telling my editors, I have a famous aunt because Eleanor is also from Des Moines, Iowa, or I don't know if she's from Des Moines, Iowa, but she lived there for many years. And I told them, I have a famous aunt who is a journalist. She also writes for young readers, and no one was believing me, right? One of the editors came back from a conference one day and said, "We met this lady at a conference. She said that she's your aunt. She's a very, established writer. Telling you that all along."
You're
So
like, are you just ignoring the illustrator over here talking talking about writers?
exactly. So they reached out to Eleanor to write this series of retold African myths, and Eleanor said, "Well, sure, but I want my nephew to become the illustrator."
That's
So
cool.
that was kind of my foot in the door to publishing. This would have been in the late 80s. So it wasn't until about 2009-ish that I had illustrated like maybe 50 educational books for young readers, and I wanted to write. But I didn't have the confidence to write. I didn't think that I spoke well. Folks were always correcting my grammar. I didn't know what it meant to like conjugate a angling participle or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like the last thing you want me to do is to write a book. But I started to study about the writing process, and I learned that writing is just like illustrating. You're telling a story.
Yeah.
Illustrate a book, I'm using my stylus, I'm using a paintbrush, I'm using acrylics to create a visual. When I am writing a story, I'm using nouns and adjectives and a story arc and emotion to tell a story. So I'm using different tools. And so I fell in love with writing just as much as I do illustrating.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, were illustrating then for commercial books for like 20 years, then obviously you must have, uh, even though you said you didn't feel confident immediately, you must have picked up some tips along the way, or just like as you read what the works that you were illustrating, must have like seen some of like, picked up some of that innately almost.
I think, well, most definitely. And when I visit elementary schools, I often tell kids to, to the best way to become a really good writer is to be a really good reader.
Yeah.
And you're not reading necessarily just for the enjoyment of the story, but you're studying the writer's style. The form that the writer is using. Is the writer telling the story using, poetry or prose? Is the writer telling the story using diary entries? Is the writer telling the story maybe through like a combination of like a graphic novel with
Yeah.
pictures and with words? So you're studying the various ways that writers go about telling a story, and you're kind of figuring out your own way. Now, how do I use these same techniques with my own style of writing? One of the things that I used to worry about is the way that I spoke. I had my grandmother's voice. My grandmother uses a lot of old English. You know what I'm saying? And she
Yeah.
used a lot of, and I'm going to probably mispronounce this words like colloquialisms or colloquial. She's
Colloquialisms.
colloquialism. Yeah, she speaks
Yeah.
like that. And so I thought, well, that's not proper English. And what I learned is that my imperfect, non-Queen's English way of speaking is the personality that I leave on the page as a writer.
That's awesome.
If you were to go into the library and all the characters spoke exactly the same way, reading would be a very boring place. So I learned that it was important to put my imperfect voice into the stories that I wrote and I wrote and I wrote every day. And when my first book was acquired by a publisher, it won the New Voices Award because my editor said, "We love your very unique way of your very unique voice."
Well, and I gotta imagine, their kids aren't speaking Queen's English all over the place too. I'm sure there are many kids that have, a similar colloquialisms to you and that sort of thing. So it helps, represent. We talk about representation in terms of like, in terms of color, in terms of race and stuff like that. But that also means the way people talk, the way that the phrases that people use, and how they see words on the page as well.
Most definitely. I often say that, it is so important for a child to be able to walk into a library and find books with images that look like them, but also it's important for them to be able to open up a book and to hear characters who speak like them,
Yeah.
who speak like the kids in their neighborhood, who speak like the people within their family and their culture. That is what can keep a child excited about reading as well.
Did you ever envision this for yourself 20, 30 years ago as you were, illustrating books, first getting into the industry, or even, like you said, back when you were at the library doing some crafts?
Most definitely not as an author. Most definitely, I never pictured myself as a writer. I thought, okay, I want to. Now, initially, when I got into the business, I wasn't sure how I was going to use my artwork. When I visit elementary schools, I tell kids I thought that I was going to be a puppet maker when I grew up.
I
I liked
like
making
that.
as a kid. So I wasn't quite sure how I was going to use my artwork. And like I say, it wasn't until I discovered children's publishing at the Perfection Learning Corporation um, that I realized that I can use my illustrations to help children learn how to read. I can use my illustrations to encourage a child who might be reluctant to go to the library to want to open up a book and check out my illustrations. And so I fell in love with using my illustrations to encourage kids.
I do. We're going to talk more about your illustrative work too, as we go forward. I do want to just ask you, when you talk, you said you had you just wanted to write your first book back. I think you said 2009. Was there a particular story you wanted to tell, or was there just like a gem of an idea you had, or what brought that upon to finally be like, I want to put words to page myself?
Well, again, I didn't see myself as a writer,
Hmm.
but I had joined an organization called the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, SCBWI. It's the International Writing and Illustrating Organization. And there's a very active and nurturing chapter here in Austin. And many of my writer friends were encouraging me. They were like, Don, you know the business. You know how to tell a story. You ought to give writing a try. And one of my friends, her name is Diana Aston. She's a very prolific author as well. She had a story that she was considering writing about outsider artist Bill Traylor. African American man once enslaved. He became one of our country's most celebrated outsider or folk artists. And so she reached out to me because she thought, I don't know that this is my story to tell. And so she said, Don, you ought to write this story. And she sent me a newspaper article. And I was like, Diana, I don't write. I, how about if you write the story and I'll illustrate it? And she said, Don, you can write. And this is not my story to tell, it's your story to tell. So I sat on this for like 2 years and I started writing in a blog just to kind of get myself used to putting my words out into the world and getting feedback. And I would get lots of positive feedback about my writing. And that's what gave me the courage to write that first book. And this is what became of that very first, idea given to me by author Diana Aston.
So it actually brings up a follow-up question I always wanted to ask you. How do you select the individuals that you are going to write about? Because I feel like when you go through your catalog of the books that you've written, it's a lot of, I would say, probably like lesser known figures in American Black history, I guess is the best way to put it. Really people, it's like people I've never heard of, and I'm not like a history major, but I like to think I know my history. But these seem like subjects that are very unique, specific stories that are very important as well. But like just kind of like not people that you're going to open up and learn about in high school history class. So how do you find these people, and how do you decide that these are stories that you want to tell?
I love stories of little known historical figures, people who were not necessarily in my childhood library as a kid.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, there weren't many, if any, um, children's picture books that featured, African American historical figures. And if they were, it was, Dr. King and Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks, and that was about the limit of it. And so when I got into publishing, I wanted to change that. And so I stumbled upon this Bill Traylor story, but I get my ideas in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I get my ideas through the research process while researching, because I'll end up in these rabbit holes in research. I'll take one path and then it leads me to another path. And then suddenly I discover the name Eugene Sandow, the father of bodybuilding. Wow, his story has not been told. So I start to do the research and I fall in love with that story. Sometimes I've been suggested or I received suggestions from teachers or students. I have a book coming out next year called A Poem for Dudley Randall. It's the story of an African American poet who also became a publisher, and he published other poets who were not able to get published during the 1960s Black Arts Movement.
Mm.
I was at a school in Chicago right before the pandemic hit, and a fifth grade teacher walked up to me and said, Don, you ought to consider writing about Dudley Randall. I had never heard of him. I wrote the name down, had no intention of writing this story really. And then the pandemic hit, and I pulled that idea out and I started doing some research, and the book's coming out next year.
That's awesome.
So many different ways.
Yeah, you must really like doing the research, though, it sounds like.
The research process is really um, probably my favorite part of the process. Right now, I'm illustrating a book about Prince. I've always been a Prince fan. I really didn't know much about Prince the person. So for the past 3 months, I've been going through books. I visited Paisley Park in Minneapolis. I've been all over the internet, researching and learning about him. And it's such a fascinating figure to learn about. And so, yeah, the research process is my favorite.
One thing we talk about libraries is that it provides a place for lifelong learning, and it really sounds like that's something that you strive for as well.
Oh, most definitely. And that's another thing that I like about illustrating for children is that I get to learn so many new things myself. I'm
Yeah.
not only an author and an illustrator, but I don't consider myself a historian, but in a way I've become a historian because I'm studying history all the time.
When you're documenting it in a way, you're documenting it through pictures and
I'm
images.
documenting it through pictures, and that is why it is so important that I get it right when I'm telling these stories. So when I'm telling a story, I always rely on primary sources. So diaries from the person that I'm writing about, or the actual, like in the case of Bill Traylor, it was important that I study his artwork. He had hundreds of pieces of artwork that he created that reflected his life while he was enslaved. He couldn't write and he couldn't read, so I didn't have anything necessarily that I could read, but I could study all of his artwork that told the story of his life. So yeah, it's so important to get history right, and especially African American history that has been erased, distorted, um, and left out of the
Yeah.
libraries for so many years.
So when you begin illustrating a book, well, How does that process work? Do you get a manuscript? Like what's the timeline like, and how do you go about starting what you want to do?
So the way that it works is an author writes a story. They have an agent, typically have a literary agent who then sells that story to a publisher who acquires the story. And then the publisher will then, they work with a pool of illustrators and they'll try to choose an illustrator whose style matches the text really well or complements the text really well or speaks to that text in some way. And so I'll get a phone call or an email from my agent, and they'll send me the manuscript, and I either love it or I don't love it. Um, and then I can look at my schedule because while, yes, I'm an author and an illustrator, I'm also a speaker. I speak at elementary schools all over the country. I do a lot of stuff like this podcast, so promotional things. So my day is divided up between all of these tasks. If the story is something that I feel like fits into my schedule, I'm excited about the subject matter, this is a story that I feel like I can really bring to life, then I'll sign on to it. To illustrate a story is funny because my very first book was called Say Hey, A Song of Willie Mays, and my editor asked me if I could illustrate this book in a year. And I did, but then I started working digital, and then I could illustrate a book in 8 months. And then I got better with digital, and then it was expected that you turn the book around in 6 months. So it's like, digital is great, but your turnaround time is also a lot less, which is good and bad because, I mean, at the same time, I can produce more books by working digital, but at the same time, you don't get a large turnaround time like I used to.
So when you work digital, is it like I guess what is that? Is it you have like a little tablet that you sketch on, or how do you work digitally? I don't know anything about honestly how this works for digital art and stuff like that in terms of like illustrating.
And I wish that I could grab my computer monitor around here so that you can see, but I have a 32-inch Cintiq right here. If you can imagine and a drawing board, a 32-inch excuse me, if you can imagine a 32-inch iPad,
Yeah.
a drawing board. So I have it right here. I can draw, and I use this stylus,
Yep.
which can serve as an oil painting brush or a pencil or a marker or any thousands of tools that you can imagine. I do all of my drawing on this Cintiq, or sometimes recently, and with the print book, I'm actually creating the illustrations on my iPad.
Oh wow.
So because the iPad is smaller, sometimes I can go downstairs and work sitting on the couch while my wife is watching football games and I'm sketching my on my iPad. I can't carry this
Yeah.
32, 60-pound Cintiq on the airplane with me when I'm traveling, but I can continue to work using my iPad.
Did that take like a different kind of skill set? Was that like something that you were excited to learn, or is that something that like you're kind of like, this is the future, I'm gonna learn it and dig in, and then you got used to it?
Well, it's funny because when I graduated from, I can't remember whether it was from high school or college, someone asked me, so what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to become a computer artist.
Oh, nice.
Now, at that time, I don't know where I got that idea from because there was no such thing as a computer artist back then. Maybe I had read some places that was going to be the future. I don't know, but there was no such thing as a computer artist back then. But little did I know that in the future, computer art would be the way that illustrators would work. So I don't know when it was, maybe 2015-ish, somewhere around in there. I was dying to get a Cintiq and I was wanted to go
Oh,
digital. So,
nice.
and I bought one and I told my editor, I'm going to illustrate my next book, which was called Whoosh, the story of the inventor of the Super Soaker Squirt Gun. I said, I'm going to illustrate this book using my Cintiq. And she was like, oh, no, 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 you're not going to do that. One, because editors, it was kind of new. A lot of illustrators weren't illustrating digitally at that time. And number two, she didn't want her book to be my test project. But I had just spent almost $5,000 on this thing, so I was dying to use it. So I did a test piece, and I didn't tell her that I did it on my Cintiq. And I showed her, and she was like, "Oh, this is a beautiful watercolor." And I was like, "It's not watercolor. It's. I did this on my Cintiq." And so that became Whoosh became my introduction to digital art. And I've not used paint or pencils or any kind of natural media since that book came out.
Wow, that's kind of what the industry a lot of ways is right now these days, you think?
I would say the majority, probably more than 90% of the books that are getting published today are done digitally. Now that's good and bad because it's it's good because it's just, you eliminate having to get your artwork scanned, you eliminate having to get it photographed. It eliminates a lot of sketches. I can just simply send my final artwork through email or over the internet to my art director, and the book is done.
Probably easier to edit too, I imagine.
Oh, so much,
Yeah.
well,
Okay.
kind of easier to edit. The whole idea is that when you're working digitally, yeah, that was what the idea. It's just so much easier to make a change. But when an art director says, "Don, can you change the position of the character's hand from this to this?" Now, if I were painting that, it might look reworked. When you're working digitally, to make a little bit of a change like that might be 19 layers.
Yeah.
You have to go back in and adjust.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, there's good and bad.
Oh no, what was the you I was gonna say what was the you're about to go on to before I interrupted you about the bad, obviously like the good, like all the you skip a lot of steps, but what was your next thing you were gonna say there?
I would say the negative is that the computer has created a lot of sameness in
Mm-hmm.
artwork. I remember a time when I could go to the bookstore, to the library, to the children's book picture book section, and just simply look at the pictures and, oh, that's Jerry Pinkney, and oh, that's Floyd Cooper, and oh, that's, you knew them by the style of artwork. Now a lot of the artwork looks the same. I'll look at the books and I'm like, okay, so that was done in Procreate, and that was done in Procreate, and that was done in Procreate.
Yeah.
But but they all look the same.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's just because the computer just kind of creates a sameness.
Do younger illustrators still have those traditional skills as well, or are a lot of them coming in digital native and doing working exclusively with digital? Like they don't have the same necessarily background as some of that traditional watercolor or sketching or stuff like that.
I think that's what it is. I think that a lot, and I don't want to be negative, but I
Yeah,
do
yeah,
think a lot of the younger illustrators, they started off, doing digital, like my little granddaughter,
yeah.
drawing on her little tablet as she's, 16 years old,
Yep.
go to art school, and they learn how to do more stuff digitally, but maybe don't know anything about an underpainting and for an oil painting,
Sure.
or building up layers of transparent paint in watercolor. So they don't know those older traditional ways of creating artwork. And that is one thing that I strive for in my own digital artwork, is that I try to create artwork that looks like how I would create it if I were doing it natural media.
All right. Well, we are running out of time here, so a few more questions I do want to ask you. Who are some of your favorite authors and illustrators we have or that are out there these days?
So I love the work of prolific author Kwame Alexander. Um, uh, I love the graphic novels created by a friend of mine, Jerry Craft, New Kid. And I love these authors not only because of the stories that they're putting out into the world, but they're just overall good, generous people who have found tremendous success in the business, and they reach back and they help others. So they're not just all about myself and I'm successful and I'm Kwame and I'm Jerry, but they also help others along the way. And so I try to, from their inspiration, do the same thing to help others along my path. I also love some of the new illustrators who are working digital, like
Yeah.
Vashti Harrison. who created the book, the Caldecott winning book Big
Oh, yep.
and Hair Love.
Yep.
I think that is probably one of the illustrators who inspired a lot of the most recent digital illustrators. Her work that she's done in Procreate.
That's awesome. All right. And so you're going to be here at the Forest Avenue Library on the 12th of December, 6:30 p.m., I believe, right?
6:30 p.m.
6:30 p.m.
Yes.
That's super exciting. Coming back to Des Moines, like you said. Hopefully, it's not too cold, but everyone should get out there. The Friends of the Forest Avenue Library are helping put on this great event. What are you going to be talking about when you come here?
So when I speak, I like to talk about my journey as a children's book author and illustrator. I share with some of the artwork that I created when I was a kid. I want kids to know that authors and illustrators are not these far away people on the other side of the world, that you too can become an author and an illustrator. You just have to work hard, and you have to dream big, and you have to never give up.
Awesome. So the great family-friendly event, it sounds like, really inspiring for a lot of kids out there, as well as some adults, I bet.
It'll be very visual. It will be a visual presentation, but I also like to be interactive. So I will do some drawing. I'll have the kids
Oh,
get up and join me in the drawing, some of the drawing activities. So most definitely a family event.
definitely. Heck yeah. I love interactive stuff like that. And I'm sure, as someone who is not at all talented in art, I do love watching great artists draw and sketch and paint, because the way of thinking is just not something that I just can't visualize the world in quite the same way. Like, so it's like just amazing to watch someone like you do that kind of thing. It sounds like it's going to be a great event again, Thursday, December 12th, 6:30 p.m. at the Forest Avenue Library. Don, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Most definitely. I look forward to being there, and I look forward to being warm.
Warm.
Hopefully.
It will be warm in the Forest Avenue Library. We can guarantee that. So, all right. Thank you so much, Don.
All right. See you soon. Bye bye.